because these races have got different languages, different religion, different cultures, and more importantly, different levels of wealth. Some are very poor, some are very rich, but the poor and the rich are each identified by their racial origins. This makes it different for us to unite under one race or one national identity. For example, let's take Australia. Australia, of course, originally belonged to the Aborigines, but the Europeans came and conquered Australia, practically eliminating the Aborigines. They then established the nation that we now call Australia. It is a country founded by the English-speaking people, and they were the dominant race in Australia. They were the first race to colonize Australia, and people who came later had to conform to this, to the definition of an Australian. That is, an Australian must be English-speaking, must have the culture basically of European origin, and they have certain features which define them as Australian. I was in Australia recently. I was in Melbourne, where I met a very unique group, Muslims. These are not white Australian. These are black and brown and yellow Australian. But these Muslims have started a school, a big school in Australia. One would have thought that they would choose the language of their countries of origin as the medium of teaching. But in Australia, all schools, whether government aided or not, use the Australian version of English as their medium of instruction. They don't have any Indian schools, Indian Australian schools, or Korean Australian schools, or Vietnamese Australian schools. They have only Australian schools where the language medium is English. And as a result, these people grow up to identify themselves with the main body of Australians, the majority, who are, of course, people of European origin. And in the case of Australia, they speak the Australian version of English. I was startled when I attended this dinner given by the Australian Muslims. I had my back to the speaker at the rostrum, and I heard a very Australian voice speaking about the function. If I had not looked at him, I wouldn't know that he is not a white Australian. He is actually an Arab Australian. But you cannot distinguish him from the voice and the way he speaks Strine, the language that evolved from the English language which is used in Australia. He sounded very much like an Australian, speaking English the way the Australians speak English. It was the same with a lady who was also not a white Australian, but a Lebanese. But she spoke with the same Australian accent. So if you don't look at the features, at the face, you would assume that they are Australians, white Australians. It is much easier, of course, for them to identify themselves as Australians because they speak the same language. They have the same culture with some addition from their own old cultures. And they move around as Australians. So, national identity for them is not too difficult. Not too difficult, although there is still this feeling that Australians who are not white are not really Australian. But believe me, in 2 generations, the children will be really full-blooded Australians. And therefore, the question of national identity is not too big a problem. The other factor, of course, is that the main group, the majority, is very big. So big that it can literally impose its will on the minorities. And that is why we see in Australia immigrants from Malaysia, from Indonesia, from India, from China. The immigrants allow themselves to be assimilated, to become Australians, despite the fact that the color of their skin and their basic religion and culture are different from the majority of the Australians who are mainly white people. Of course, the problem of national identity is not so easily solved, even in Australia, where people of different origins, different races, have absorbed the Australian culture, Australian language, and the behavior habits of the Australian. You can see that if a country is single ethnic, then the problem of national identity is not a big problem. It is almost natural for them to consider themselves as having one identity. The Russians consider themselves as Russians, the Germans, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Chinese, all of them find no difficulty at all in accepting their national identity. But we have a problem in Malaysia. We have a problem because Malaysia is multiracial. And therefore, we are faced with this problem of integrating this multiracial population. It was assumed at the beginning that Malaysian identity would